are going to be in place to help you endure. That's where I think religion plays a very, at least for me, religion plays a very important role. But I know we can weave some of our answers in. But I appreciate the honesty of and candor of your answers, though.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So what we're going to do is there's going to be one student who's going to be standing on this side, and one student in the middle. You want to be in the middle? You can be in the middle. And why don't you stand on this side? We'll have somebody else in the middle. Who has the second mic? You have the second mic. All right. Good. So come in the middle. If you want to ask a question, start lining up behind our students, and then you can ask your question. And as you're doing that, I will start off by asking a question to Dr. Jackson in particular, which is, through the examination of your book, what is the response that you came to with Islamic theology on the issues that Jones raises in his original work?
Let me try to preface my response with a few words about the overall purpose of that book. My purpose was not so much to arrive at definitive answers to the question of black theodicy as raised by Jones. My real intention was to force Muslim theological discourse into an arena of relevance. In other words, I was trying to take Muslim theology out of the Middle East and put it in America, and then force it to survive on its own. Force it to make whatever adjustments need to be made. Force it to answer whatever questions need to be asked, because I believe that this is critical to the development of a truly American Islam. So that was the real impetus behind the book. Beyond that, it wasn't my attempt to proffer my own personal response to Jones, but rather to let the Muslim schools of theology speak for themselves, and to model the fact that, contrary to what many people think, Islam is not a monolith. When we talk about Muslim theology, we're not talking about one thing. We're not talking about, even cognates. I mean, we got theological schools that are diametrically opposed to each other in terms of some of their basic presuppositions. So part of what I was trying to do was model that. Now, I think, thank you. I mean, as far as an answer goes, I think one of the biggest discoveries to be made in that book has to do with the different ways in which we can understand all powerful and all good when it comes to God. There are different constructions of omnipotence. Omnipotence does not say, according to the Muslim theologians, that God, if he's all powerful, that he has to translate everything that he wants into being. And therefore, there are many things that God could do that God does not do. And for the Muslim theologians, that is not a contradiction of omnipotence. And we could say equal things about omnibenevolence. And it's in those differences that the Muslim theologians come up with different responses to Jones than the ones that we may have thought were the only responses that were possible, assuming that God was all powerful and all good. So that was what I was trying to do in that work.
And I should say he's highly successful in doing that in that text. Absolutely.
Excuse me, Dr. Jackson, sort of a student of history, and I think one of the crowning achievements of Islam was the Moorish Caliphate in Spain. But that lasted hundreds of years. And what I understood was one of the most expressive, prolific, and endearing periods of Islam in terms of its relationship with other religions in the world. So it wasn't until the end where certain other interests overtook it, but it was hundreds of years forward supporting the
Can you speak up, please?
excuse me. In supporting the monks of Europe, in terms of maintaining the intellectual sort of treasure of Europe, or the Middle East. So, what is it that we've lost in that conversation between hundreds of years? Powers. Balance between Judaism and Moorish.
Well, I think that I think that. What's the question, please? Oh, wow. What was you had a Muslim caliphate in Spain, Moorish caliph, that was pluralistic, intolerant, and even supportive of various and sundry other religious communities. What was lost in that, to the point that no longer seems to be typical of what we tend to think when we think of Muslims coming into political power. Is that a fair? I think, first of all, the first thing I would want to say is that, again, we have to be careful about the amount of credence that we give to histories that are not only written by people who are not the history makers themselves, but written in a context where there is civilizational competition going on. And what I'm referring to is the fact that you mentioned a Moorish caliphate. Well, the term Moor actually comes from Moriscos, which was sort of a term that the Spanish Reconquistas imposed on the Muslims once the Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity. So what you have in Spain is an Umayyad caliph, and not a Moorish caliph. But that aside, I think that it's really important to do a couple of things. First of all, we cannot assume that everything that Muslims do, they do for religious reasons. They're good Muslims, they're middle Muslims, and they're bad Muslims. Sometimes Muslims act out of religious motivations, sometimes they act out of purely political motivations, and there are all kinds of other motivations. So when we ask what happened, well, we might be able to explain that, but that might tell us very little about Islam. All right, depending on the basis of the reasons themselves. The other thing is that I do think that it was quite typical of the Muslim religious establishment to be very tolerant of other communities. And one of the reasons for that was that, contrary to what many people think, and Professor West talks about the distinction between prophetic and Constantinian Christianity, well, the Muslim religious establishment actually emerged in conscious opposition to the Muslim state. It refused to hand religion over to the state as a tool to be used to do the state's bidding. And I'm reminded, and you have to keep this in context, it's 1,000 years ago. There's a debate by a Spanish Muslim by the name of Ibn Hazm and a Jew by the name of Ibn al-Naghrilah, who was a very prominent Jew from a very prominent Jewish family in Spain. And Ibn al-Naghrilah had written a refutation of the Quran. This is a Muslim Spain. A Jew writes a refutation of the Quran. And Ibn Hazm writes a refutation of Ibn Naghlîla's refutation. And in the introduction to his refutation, he says the following: you have denigrated the book of Islam, and it is nothing other than Islam that stands between your neck and my sword. In other words, this is 1,000 years ago. Let us not get too temple-centric. That's what they have in their business back then. 1,000 years ago. But in other words, what he was saying, that even if I wanted to, if I'm to be true to my religion, I cannot harm you. All I can do is refute you. And so there is an extent to which Islam has traditionally struggled with what is the right relationship between the religious establishment and the state. And for most of its history, the religious establishment eschewed the state and did not become a part of it. Certainly not in order to do its bidding. So when we talk about what has happened, I think that that's part of what's happened, because the whole modern experience in Islam is one whereby the nation-state structure is one where religion simply becomes an automatic part of the state, and the state is able then to preside over religion and use it for its own purposes. All right? And today in the Muslim world, it's a very difficult formula to get the religious establishment to declare its independence from the state in such a way that it can do its business in the way that it sees fit. So there are a lot of explanations for that, and I think that I would shy away from overly simplistic ones, but these are just some indications that might put you on the way to intelligently thinking about these kinds of issues.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for a very meaningful conversation, and thank you for being so thought-provoking. My name is Adnan, and it's good to see you, Dr. Jackson, again, and Dr. West. I got to hear you in Rutgers, so thank you again. I'm going to read a couple comments. Given your assumed decline, Dr. West, of American hegemony and American empire, you call for the restoration of the deep democratic ethos and fundamental philosophy, and I understand that. I agree with you with that. And you also both, I think, call for a need for a renaissance in the prophetic tradition, going back towards compassion and justice. Now, I'm an optimistic person, but at the same time, I guess I watch too much CNN, MSNBC, and Fox more than I should, but perhaps. But at the same time, I'm an optimist. And now, after seeing everything we've been through since the election of Barack Obama, it's taken a woman in a historically man's house, Nancy Pelosi, and a black man in a White House, Barack Obama, to move the country towards more compassionate health care and start with a step towards affordability in college education, which I think is moving towards that compassionate arc that you're talking about. But as a result of what we've seen, the response is the Tea Party movement, people spitting on Congress, members like John Lewis, Andre Carson, death threats to Congress, and suspicions continue that Barack Obama is a closet Muslim, things like that. So my question is the arc of justice broken? And do we live in a regime of false ideals, like you were saying, Dr. Jackson earlier mentioned that phrase? And is this a country of the survivor of the fittest, and will it always be that way?
Quick two comments. I think that, again, part of what it means for me to be a Muslim is, on the one hand, not to be either overly naive or quixotic in my